Hi folks, welcome to today's video. We are going to be talking about changes in ideology. So we've already talked about what ideology is and what the spectrum looks like, but there are a couple of things that affect our ideology, especially as we grow up, we age, we get older, and we experience life. Events happen throughout our life cycle that will impact our political ideology. So this video corresponds with notes 3.3, so make sure that you are on the right video. And our objective for today is to explain how generational differences, life cycle events, and political events impact our social or our political ideology and our socialization. So when we're looking at changes in ideology, we see that ideology can change for two reasons. And sometimes in an individual's lifetime, both of these reasons are why ideology changes. It's not just one or the other. The first thing that we see are generational effects, and that's what we're going to talk about first. But this means that ideology can change from one generation to another. So, this is really looking at how the different generations that we have, we're going to be talking about the silent generation, the boomers, the millennials, how they view politics differently, why, and also how they vote. So, we're going to look at trends in their ideology as well. And ideology can also change as an individual ages and moves through the life cycle. So, life cycle events can also impact and change ideology as well. So, let's talk about some of those generational effects. One of the things that we see with generation is that we have different voting patterns and political beliefs for people in different generations. Now, as you can see in this image, we have baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. We are going to be talking about a generation that is not in this picture, and that is the silent generation. And that would be before the baby boomers. So those born before 1945. So we'll talk about that. But we are going to be really focusing on these four generations. Now, the trend is with generations over time, the younger generations are more liberal. So, if you think about it, when the silent generation, right, the elders right now in our society, when they were growing up, they were the more progressive and more liberal. Then the baby boomers came along, right, and so on and so forth. So millennials right now are the most liberal, but Gen Z here will most likely take over as the most liberal once millennials change or an age. Now, millennials, when we're talking about this group, are the under 40 population. I am just about a millennial. I'm like right at the very, very end of the millennial generation. Based on when you look, I could also be considered Gen Z. Some of the dates change. But if we're looking at millennials, this generation, unlike the rest of their predecessors, are more liberal, as I've said, than their previous and older generations. So trends and beliefs that we see among millennials are more accepting of various conditions, lifestyles, things like that. So when we're looking at interracial and same-sex marriages, millennials are more likely to be accepting of that. Millennials are often pro legalization of marijuana. And a large part of why we see some of these trends is because millennials are the most ethnically and racially diverse group than previous generations as well. A lot of the way that millennials have grown up is with technology, starting in the 80s, right? That has led to a little bit of a shift in ideology as well. We'll talk about that here in a second. Typically, we see millennials that are supportive of government action to solve problems. So I want to talk about here really quickly in terms of foreign policy and economic views when it comes to millennials. Now, I mentioned that the millennials were raised in a technology environment. That's really the first generation to be raised in that type of climate. And that has had an impact on how millennials view foreign policy. So, foreign policy is all about our relationship as a country with other countries, right? That could be war, peace, anything dealing with another country. Because of this new technology and expanded social media, the internet, millennials have basically been opened up to the global perspective when it comes to views and politics. So, millennials, we see as a trend, are more willing to promote cooperation versus the use of force in foreign events. So millennials are less likely to want to go and invade countries versus, taking a more diplomatic approach. One of the things that we also notice with millennials is that fewer identify themselves as patriotic than other generations. Now, economic wise, millennials tend to be business friendly, but they're not opposed to government regulation to protect the consumer. They want to protect that consumer, they want to protect the environment, and ultimately society at large. So, this is another area where we see some pretty liberal leaning views surrounding economics. Now, the silent generation is the opposite. This is the oldest generation that we're going to talk about. And to be very honest, we probably won't be talking about this in future AP government classes because the silent generation is slowly leaving us. But these are those people born before 1945. And the silent generation tends to be the most conservative of the generations that we see. If you are wondering, I don't know if you guys are, but I couldn't find really a good picture to represent the silent generation. So to make it more personal, I included the wedding photo of my grandparents. They were born in the 1920s, so they were most definitely a part of the silent generation, guys. I'll tell you what. So, trends and beliefs of the silent generation. When we're looking at foreign policy, a lot of this is driven by their conservative tendencies, right? We have to think about the context of the time in which they grew up. They grew up largely post World War II in the Cold War. So, communism was like enemy number one for this generation. Many supported involvement in Southeast Asia as we were going over to prevent the spread of communism, and that continued on in through the rest of their lives. So they're more likely to support military action versus millennials, for instance. Now, socially, if we're looking at the silent generation, when they were growing up, the silent generation took a lot of the conservative ideals from their parents, right? We talked about family was a huge political or cultural factor in socialization. And that is very, very true for the silent generation. For this group, religious values were a very, very high priority. And they really opposed what was going on in the 1960s, the counterculture, the Cultural Revolution that brought about changes like, segregation. These people grew up during segregation. They were slow to accept integration that resulted from the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. This generation often didn't support the challenge to authority during the 1960s that the younger generation brought, right? Because it brought about changes in the traditional role of the family, casual drug use. There was a lot of new traditions being started. And as we know, conservatism wants to keep traditions the way that they are. Today, the silent generation that is still with us wants government to be tougher on criminals, terror suspects. They're more likely to oppose gay marriage, be pro-life, right? A lot of that religion is still evident in their ideology. Now, voting. I do want to talk about voting. The silent generation and the older generation, so the boomers, are the most reliable voters. They are consistently the largest population that votes on election day, no matter what type of election it is. So they are the highest percentages when it comes to voting. Now, let's talk about life cycle effects. Life cycle effects refer to the variety of physical, social, and psychological changes that people go through as you age. So, as you go through the stages of your life, right, your focus and what you deem as important shifts. Right? What's important to you now as a high schooler is probably going to be very different from you in middle age and when you are elderly, right? So that is what we mean when we say life cycle effects. For example, college age students, they're going to be probably concerned about student loans, student debt, paying off that debt, finding a job that has a good income and provides healthcare benefits. As a result, right, we've seen that based on those issues, a large portion of various populations and generations will shift to a certain candidate. So in 2016, 2020, many millennials were drawn to Bernie Sanders, who called for free public education, corporate regulations, expansion of Medicare and healthcare. So those were the issues that were really important to the millennial or younger generations. Now, as people in this group, right, as they age and move into the next stage of life, priorities are going to shift, right? They might shift to issues that more directly affect them. As you have kids, maybe it's the economy, education, right? And then as you advance further into the life cycle and you reach senior citizen age, seniors are more worried about, you know, Social Security, retirement, Medicare, the price of prescription drugs, and those issues change how we view politics. Now, finally, here before we move into the end of the video, I do want to talk about how political events can influence our ideology. Major political events, these where were you when moments, can also shape political ideology. And I'll kind of explain what I mean by that in a second. But most people are going to forge their political beliefs between the ages of 14 and 24. And how we respond in the aftermath of these significant events can shape our ideology for the rest of our lives. So, for example, I'm going to talk about the older generation. The older generations lived through the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War. Those are some pretty big events that had lasting consequences on their ideologies, right? With the Great Depression, this economic downturn that caused horrible unemployment, right? This event caused greater government regulation in social issues, in the economy. And what that did was led to a more favorable attitude toward government involvement. FDR's New Deal put people into work, which was a very positive thing for the people living in this time period. Right. And this expanded government was seen as a positive, and that really advanced the trust in the government and support for the role of government in providing a social safety net. Now, as this generation then experienced World War II, right, we see the country unite against fascism, the Nazi Party. And this is going to create a sense of reliability in the government. So it's only going to bring the people of this generation closer together. Women are going to enter the workforce during World War II, is going to redefine the role of women, help shape attitudes about gender, which are going to then change policy in the future. And then the Cold War, right? They're going to stand behind the Cold War just like they did during World War II as we're fighting communism overseas. So just like we talked about, the older generations tend to be more conservative, especially when it comes to foreign policy. The older generations are going to trust and support the government during a time when involvement in Vietnam, for example, was highly criticized. So they're going to support the government and refrain from criticizing it, even though the success of the Vietnam War was coming into question and failure was imminent. Now, baby boomers. Yes, boomers. I know, you guys can think that all you want. Boomers are going to live through a pretty chaotic time as well. They're going to live through and grow up in the 1960s. And the 1960s largely protests, assassinations. There was a lot of upheaval that happened during the 1960s as the baby boomers were coming of political age. Kennedy was assassinated. Civil rights movements against segregation and discrimination were taking place. The Vietnam War was being protested. The draft was being protested. Challenging the government during this time period became almost the norm, right? This idea that the people had the power to bring change through their actions when they disagreed with the government. Now, what we see is that boomers were Democratic until 2006. And then they switched to the Republican Party as they aged. So, as they aged, just like we kind of saw with, or as I mentioned before, those generational effects, as they have aged, baby boomers have switched to the Republican or conservative party. Now, the younger generation is arguably the era that you and I are growing up in, and these are the political events that have helped to shape our views. Right? 9/11, the war on terror, the Great Recession. Right? And I want to point out that when we're looking at 9/11, 9/11 and a lot of these events can really be interpreted two different ways. It's not like a one or the other. It's how you interpret the events shape your political views from here on out, right? So with 9/11, you could look at it in one of two ways. One, an attack on US soil calls for more aggressive homeland security and counterterrorism, right? A more strict foreign and homeland security policy. On the other hand, you could look at this event and think that it should serve as a wake-up call to the United States that we should not be as involved in the Middle East as we are, right? So taking that more liberal approach to foreign policy, right? As 9/11 unfolded and we have the aftermath of the war on terror invading Afghanistan and Iraq to supposedly eliminate weapons of mass destruction, right? Afghanistan is going to become the longest military conflict outside of Vietnam. Iraq's weapons of mass destruction was groundless. There were no weapons of mass destruction. So this led to a lot of the younger generations believing that the war on terror was a mistake and that the United States should stay out of world affairs. And then the Great Recession was also a huge event that shaped ideology as well. When the economy slumped in 2008, this led to an increased acceptance of government intervention, more than we had seen in years past, especially when the economy is failing, right? We saw this shift to wanting to increase government support and involvement. So the younger generation, as a result of these events, we've seen especially reinforce and shift to the Democratic Party and lean more liberal. All right, guys, so your objective for this video was to explain how generational differences, life cycle events, and political events impact our ideology and socialization. Make sure to answer the question at the end of the Edpuzzle. Go back if you need to and answer any questions or fill in any blanks, and I will talk to you guys in class. See ya.